Allow me to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jonathan Lazar. Dr. Lazar is a professor in the College of Information Studies, the iSchool at University of Maryland. Dr. Lazar joined the iSchool in 2019 after 19 years as a professor of computer and information sciences at Towson University, where he served as director of the Information Systems program for 14 years. Dr. Lazar has authored or edited 12 books on the subject of accessibility. He has published over 140 articles in journals, conference proceedings, and edited books, and has been granted 2 U.S. patents for his work on accessible web-based security features for blind users. He frequently serves as an advisor to government agencies and regularly provides testimony at federal and state levels, and multiple U.S. federal regulations cite his research publications. He's been on the executive board of the Friends of the Maryland Library for the Blind and Physically Handicapped since 2009, co-chair of the Cambridge University Workshop on Universal Access and Assistive Technology since 2012, and has been on the program committee of the ACM Conference for Accessible Computing most years since 2006. So welcome to our conference. Even when they picked you to be a speaker, I did not realize how deep your credentials went. I just knew I really liked an article you read.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Pat. Thank you for the kind welcome, and thank you for your kind words. And first of all, to everyone taking part in the conference, let me say congratulations. You made it to day 3 in the afternoon after lunch. So now I have to warn you, the last time that I was actually speaking after lunch on day 3, an earthquake occurred just as I started to speak. So this might be a good time if you just want to check and see, where the exits are in your house. This is actually a true story. I'm not making this up. There was an earthquake in 2011. You may remember on the East Coast. And I got up and said, "Hi, everyone," and an earthquake occurred. So it's the only time in my professional career ever where I started speaking and people actually fled the building in fear of their lives. So that's not metaphorical. That actually happened. Anyway, so hopefully there will not be any earthquakes today. Hopefully, though, I will be able to rock your world when it comes to how you can make your public libraries more inclusive for patrons with print disabilities. Now, it used to be in the past that if someone came to the public library and had a print disability, meaning, again, trouble seeing print, handling print, or cognitively processing print, that usually you tell that patron, we'll go to the State Library for the Blind and Physically Handicapped. And of course, now that's known as Library and Print Disabled, and your great services in Georgia are known by a different name, by GLASS. And so that used to be the past. But now you can serve people with print disabilities at your local library with accessible digital content, right? And so this is something, obviously over the last few years, more and more of the content has changed so that it's digital content rather than your traditional paper books. What that means is that you can actually serve people at your local library who have print disabilities and need things in alternate formats, because actually the alternate format is a digital format. So you're almost there. This is really exciting. Now, you might be thinking, okay, here's another presenter telling us, we're already overstretched, we're underfunded, we work really hard, right? You may be thinking this is another thing that as a librarian you're being asked to do. It may be like this recent article in the Washington Post. We're in the Washington Post. They had a whole story about mastering getting a vaccine appointment. And their big suggestion in the article was, go to your local library. Librarians can help you get an appointment. And I was just, I read that and I contacted the people who direct the MLIS program, and I was just like, oh, no. The Washington Post suggested yet another thing librarians should do outside of their scope, outside of their mission. Don't worry, this is not like that. If you look at the ALA core values of librarianship, it specifically discusses, right, accessible formats and making sure that you provide information resources, right, that are equally and equitably accessible to all library users, regardless of technology, format, or methods of delivery. And the statement on diversity also discusses that we have to provide a full spectrum of resources and services to the communities we serve. So unlike some of the things that as librarians you get asked to do, actually making sure that content is in an accessible format so you can serve people with print disabilities, that is a core value of librarianship according to the ALA. So how will this talk be structured? Well, I'm going to start by talking about technical foundations of digital accessibility. Then I will talk about how to start planning for digital accessibility at your library. And then I'll give an example of a partnership to do so from Baltimore County, Maryland. All right, so let's get started. I think the good news so far, there hasn't been an earthquake, right? No one's been forced to flee. We're all good? Okay, no earthquakes. Just in case, the exits are here, here, and there are also 2 in the back. Remember, the nearest exit may be behind you. It is right, oh, sorry, it is over there. Okay, so let's start by talking about technical foundations of digital accessibility. Now, this is something that many of you probably already know in your gut, that it used to be libraries had primarily print-related materials. And so when you wanted to serve someone with a print disability, you'd send them to the specialized state resource, the LBPH, now of course the LBPD, about serving patrons with print disabilities. But as libraries started providing multimedia and access to digital libraries and ebooks, right, there became an opportunity. And of course, now many libraries are either exclusively or primarily serving digital format. So COVID has really increased that trend, right? Digital format of library materials. There are a lot of people who weren't using ebooks until the pandemic, and now they're expecting their libraries to rent them out ebooks. So let's start talking about digital accessibility, right? First of all, when we talk about digital accessibility, what do we mean? Well, keep in mind that all content starts out inherently accessible. It's usually developers or designers who add the barriers. Now, we have many laws that require accessible content. For libraries, we have federal laws, we have state laws. And what it means, accessibility means that a person with a disability can secure the same information and engage in the same transactions as a person without a disability with substantially equivalent ease of use. So that means that if it takes someone who doesn't have any type of disability, right, 1 minute to get in the building, and it takes someone, right, 30 minutes to get in the back of the building if they're a wheelchair user, because they have to go up a ramp, and then there's a freight elevator, and then they have to wait and buzz something to wait for another elevator. Okay, you know what it means to have equivalent ease of use or not equivalent ease of use in a physical accessibility setting. What it means for digital accessibility is that we want to make sure that it takes about the same amount of time for someone with or without a disability to access the content. There can't be extra barriers in place. Like, it's technically accessible, but really we know you're gonna have to take 10 extra steps. No. And there are 2 aspects of accessibility. One is making sure that a user has the right tool that they need. So it could be that, for instance, you have someone who's blind and they need a screen reader so that they can listen to what's on the screen. So such as JAWS or VoiceOver, NVDA. It could be that someone has an alternate pointing device, right? Or that they have something related to eye tracking or voice recognition. That's on the user themselves or working with the state rehab services agency to make sure they have the right tools. But the tools don't help if you don't have library resources. So software, digital content, websites that are accessible and flexible enough to work with all those different assistive technologies. So that's really important. Right? People often say, well, do we have to provide screen readers? No, you have to provide the digital content that's accessible for people with screen readers. Now, some library systems do offer screen readers, that's fine. But the key thing is that the user is generally responsible for having their own tools, but you are responsible for making sure your library has accessible digital content so that way it can work with whatever tool the user has. And that's all accessibility is. From the point of view of the library, making sure that the software, digital content, and websites will be compatible, will be flexible enough to be compatible with all the different input and output devices that people use, right? So we want content to be designed to be flexible and be presented in many different formats. And flexibility helps all users. Remember, by the way, all users have situational impairments, right? If you're driving a car and you want to maybe listen to something, but obviously you can't take your eyes off of driving, or you're in a library where you can't play things out loud, right? But it would really help to have things captioned on a video. So accessibility helps everyone. And when we talk about accessibility, it's actually a broad range of users. We've got people who have perceptual impairments, so people who are blind, low vision, deaf, or hard of hearing, people with motor impairments, so people who have limited use of either speech, limited use of hands. You might have a spinal cord injury. You might just have something like carpal tunnel. And people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, so learning disabilities, Down syndrome, dyslexia, dyscalculia. Generally, this label of print disabilities, we talk about, print-related disabilities, means people who either have trouble seeing print, right? People who have trouble physically handling print, like for instance, if you were paralyzed, or people have trouble cognitively processing print. And so for a lot of people who have learning disabilities, it's helpful for them to hear the content at the same time that they're seeing the content. It helps them actually process the content better. So accessibility is always about flexibility and making people more productive. Now, there are 3 technical guidelines that relate to content accessibility. Because there are actually a lot of different guidelines related to accessibility, but some of them are not really relevant for the library situation. So for instance, the guidelines that relate to developing new types of browsers, right? You're probably not going to build a new software browser or a new web development tool at your library. But because you're providing so much content, we want to know about the guidelines that relate to content, right? And the 3 accessibility guidelines that relate to digital content are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We sometimes call them WCAG, Accessible EPUB 3 Guidelines, and PDF Universal Access. If you know what a PDF document is in Adobe Acrobat, those are the guidelines for making Acrobat documents accessible. Now, let's start with talking about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, hopefully many of you have heard of those. Those are the international technical standards for making web content accessible, and they are the most well-accepted, well-documented accessibility guidelines in the world. By the way, if you learn best by watching a music video, there's a great music video. If you go to YouTube, just search on WCAG music video. If that's how you learn best, truthfully, I think it's fun to watch anyway. But you may wake up in the middle of the night with the WCAG, I want to show you the WCAG. Just so you know, it may become like an earwig. It may, you may be singing it when you're trying to get to sleep in the middle of the night. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, have actually been in place for over 20 years. The first guidelines, first version 1.0 were issued in 1999. We are currently in version 2.1 of the WCAG. Now, on the screen right now, you see a map of where in the world they use WCAG, where it's included in some type of national law. It's most of South America. It's most of North America. It's most of Europe. It's most of Southeast Asia and East Asia, Australia, New Zealand. So the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, are really used throughout the world. And by the way, I noticed in the captioning, when I say WCAG, it's coming up as WCAG. So I see WCAG. So, that's what happens with automated captioning. And from the WCAG defines how to make web content more accessible to people with disabilities involving a wide range of disabilities, right? And of course, as we know, these guidelines, this flexibility not only helps people with disabilities, it also helps make content more usable by older users, right? People with changing abilities, people with learning disabilities. And I'm especially proud that the original draft of the WCAG, of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, started as the Trace Center Unified Web Accessibility Guidelines. So the WCAG actually started at the Trace Center, where I'm currently the associate director, and I'm actually the director starting this fall. So I'm very excited that the Trace Center was a part of creating the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, the four core concepts of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, right? And the easy way to remember that, P-O-U-R, pour. So, and here's a visual. You can remember me taking a drink as I say Pour, P-O-U-R. Perceivable means that people with different types of disabilities can perceive the information, regardless of whether they, let's say, they cannot hear it and they need captioning, or they can't see it and they need a screen reader to give them output. That's perceivable. Operable means that the web content should, and the user interface component should be operable if you, right, let's say you can't use a pointing device, or let's say that you can use speech recognition, but you can't use a keyboard. So operable means that you have to be able to operate the website. Understandable means that you need to have the text and the content that is marked up using proper markup so you can figure out the sections, the headings, right? And that also that it's written in plain language so people can understand. And robust, meaning that it has to work with current and future assistive technologies. So P-O-U-R, again, I'm going to take a drink. P-O-U-R, that's how you can remember the core concepts of the WCAG. Okay. Now, the WCAG actually makes a lot of sense. If you think about what you need for people with disabilities in terms of web content at your library and digital content, it makes sense. All the graphics need to have alternative text describing the image. There should be no flashing on the page that could potentially trigger seizures. Tables and forms should be marked up in a way that actually makes sense and you can identify. So listing it as field 1, field 2, or form 1, form 2, that doesn't tell you anything. But if you label it as first name, last name, that's much more useful. You want to make the web content accessible. If you can't use a pointing device, but let's say you can only use keyboard access, and a lot of other assistive technologies utilize keyboard access. You want to make sure that all videos have captioning. And I gave you a link at the bottom of the screen there to the quick reference for WCAG. The thing to keep in mind is that the Web Accessibility Initiative has created multiple versions of WCAG, multiple sizes, you should say, multiple flavors, depending on how much technology expertise you have and how much content you can kind of have time to process. The quick ref is a really great way to get started, right? There's also even like a quick tooltips for top 10 things to do. You could also look at the full document. It is the most well-documented set of digital accessibility guidelines in the world, but it's really helpful to actually have kind of different size versions, like small, medium, and large, depending on your technology expertise and how much time you have. So make sure you find the version that's right for you to help you understand the concepts of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. As an example of how web accessibility helps everyone, captioning, right? Now, of course, captioning, by the way, can I do a quick lightning quiz, and Pat, you'll jump in and tell me if anyone knows the answer? Pat, will that work?
Yes, 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 yes.
Okay, so lightning quiz. What was the first TV show, right? In what year that had captioning? What was the first TV show that had captioning? Does anyone know? If so, put in the chat and Pat will tell me if anyone knows. I mean, don't bother searching for it. I know you're all librarians and you can find the answer within under a minute. You know what I mean. If you know it, just put it in the chat. Don't take this as like a searching assignment. I know you all can find it.
I've got a couple of answers coming in. Captain Kangaroo, Love Boat, I Love Lucy, Cooking with Julia White.
You mean, wait. Is it Julia Child? Is that what they meant rather than...
I don't know.
Actually, the French chef, Julia Child, right? The first TV show to be captioned. Now, you might say, why is this an important question? Why is he asking, aside from the fact that he likes cooking? Because anytime you get someone saying, oh, well, no, captioning, we can't do this new technology of captioning. This new technology of captioning comes from the early 1970s. So just so you know, captioning has been around for almost 50 years, right? So captioning is not a new technology. Please don't think of it as a new technology. Now, while captioning was originally designed for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, captioning is used and useful in many different ways, right? For instance, people who are in a noisy location or a quiet location. If you're in a library and don't have a headset, you can turn on captioning, right? If you're in a noisy location like a bar, a gym, an airport. An airport, does anyone remember what an airport is? I haven't been there in so long. Eventually, we'll all make it back to airports. You'll be thankful for captioning then. Captioning is used by people learning English. It's used by people searching a video. It's used by people for whom the captioning is helpful if they have a learning disability to process information by getting both seeing the text and hearing it as well. So captioning is a great example. It's useful for everyone. So that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Next, we are going to talk about EPUB 3. Now, hopefully many of you have already heard about EPUB 3. Accessible EPUB 3 is the standard for ebooks and digital publications and documents. EPUB 3 is a little over 10 years old at this point. And EPUB 3 just makes it really easy. If you have a print disability and you want to navigate an ebook, it's not just sitting there passively listening, but EPUB 3 format lets you actually access, right? Jump into one page, jump to another section, right? EPUB 3, and by the way, EPUB 3 is much easier than a PDF document to make accessible. So making an accessible EPUB 3 document is easier to do than PDF accessibility. But EPUB 3 has actually gained a lot of traction in the last 5-6 years. So I'll tell you what, universities, most of the digital textbooks are now available in EPUB 3 format. On the screen right now, you have a chart from Bookshelf, from the Bookshelf application. And they had posted about how between 2015 and the middle of 2019, before the pandemic, it used to be that PDF books, right, out in the top 500 books from the Bookshelf application, 20 million users, PDF books outranked EPUB books by about 4-1, right? Now, EPUB books are at least twice, almost 3 times as popular as PDF books. So EPUB 3 is taking over from PDF. Now, let's talk about accessible PDF. Now, the standards you use are known as the PDF UA, Universal Accessibility Format. It's also known as the Matterhorn Protocol. I will tell you up front that it is harder to make a PDF document accessible than it is to make either an HTML or an EPUB 3. And the reason why is that the tools at this point are insufficient. I know I work in collaborative research with Adobe to try to make their tools better. So help is on the way. We're working on tools with Adobe to make it better. But just realize that there are standards for PDF accessibility, and many of them are available if you have a full version of Adobe Acrobat Pro, right? They actually do have tools for making all the fixes. It's just that sometimes they're hard to find and hard to use. So those are your 3 guidelines for digital content: Accessible EPUB 3, PDF UA, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There are a lot of other technical standards that relate to certain other types of technologies for accessibility, but those are probably going to be less relevant for your library work. So for instance, the User Agent Accessibility Guidelines or the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, Kiosk Accessibility Guidelines. And by the way, most of these come from an international standards body known as the World Wide Web Consortium, the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI, which is part of W3C. But you may be interested, once you've learned the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, there's guidance from them about actually using the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines for applying those core concepts to other non-web technologies like software, operating systems, things like that. So just to be aware of some other standards that do exist. So that's the first part of the talk. Again, it looks like we've had no earthquake, so that's good. Everyone's still here with me. That's good. We're going to move on to the second part, which is how to start planning for accessibility. What do you do? How do you start? So you've decided as a library that you want to start doing this. You want to figure out how to engage your library, right, with more people with print disabilities. So I would start with, first of all, getting to know the technical side, just becoming familiar with some of the tech standards, right, like WCAG, like EPUB 3, like PDF UA. Once you become a little bit familiar with them, then the next step is to do a self-study, right? Do a self-study so you can figure out at your library, how are we doing right now? How accessible are we? What do we have that's accessible and what do we have that's not? And for doing this, there are a lot of great resources. I suggest accessibility.arl.org, the Association of Research Libraries. They have a whole accessibility toolkit. And realize that some of these are things that you can read stories from other libraries, involve community members, right? Do ongoing testing and VPATs, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. procurement, right? Staff training at the library. There are well-established ways to do this. So you're not out there on your own. You can use what other people and other libraries have already been doing. So what are some areas of focus? Now, probably when it comes to digital content, your two top areas, the ones in bold, are website accessibility and maintenance, and then your library content, the content that you're offering to library patrons. So databases, digital libraries, multimedia, ebooks, all these types of things. You might also consider staff awareness and training, physical environment to the library accessibility, marketing materials, but probably your focus at the beginning is just going to be on website accessibility and content. Now, you can start by testing your website, evaluating your website for accessibility. If you aren't familiar with whether your website is accessible or not, there's generally one of three ways that you test your website. One is that you do usability testing involving people with disabilities. So one great thing to do is if you already have like an advisory board of people with disabilities in your local neighborhood, right? Patrons with disabilities. If you have any groups that meet normally at your library, monthly groups of people with disabilities. If not, you can see if you can locate a local advocacy group. Maybe it could help you out. So it's generally very effective to do testing involving people with disabilities, testing the interface and showing you where there are accessibility barriers. Now, a second way is to do expert reviews. If you have someone on your staff or someone in the community who can help do inspections, do some code inspections, test it with an assistive technology, right? And so that can be useful. I want to warn you about automated testing tools. Now, it's going to feel natural, like, oh, I can just go to one of these websites. I do a web search on web accessibility. It points me to all these tools. I can put in my library name, right, .org, and it'll just tell me where all my accessibility barriers are. Beware of automated testing tools. Generally, they will not give you, right, accurate findings about how accessible or how inaccessible your website is. So what the tools are really good at is scanning thousands of web pages, looking for potential problems related to accessibility. Potential doesn't mean it's an actionable problem, right? Or the presence of accessibility features. Can't tell you if they're actually implemented right. So, often you'll go to a tool, let's say, go to your library homepage, type in your library homepage, right, in the tool, and it will come back. There are 80 accessibility errors, 200 potential accessibility errors, and 500, things that are flagged. And you'll say, oh my gosh, that's going to take us months and years. This is too hard. We can't do it. Realize that a lot of the automated accessibility testing tools are not giving you accurate results, right? They are trying to flag anything that potentially could be a problem, even if it's not. So please, tools scare people away. Find ways to understand how the tools work, but don't just take the first response. Tools are really great at scanning millions of web pages. They're not really good at giving you a first pass estimate as to whether your website or even your homepage at the library is accessible or not. So please don't be scared away by tools. Again, I'm working with some tool manufacturers on this, but these are like big long-term projects. So don't be scared away by automated tools. If, let's say, you do have access to people with disabilities who could do some testing for you, right? What you could do is you could even do a sampling of web pages on your site and a sampling of digital content. If you don't have the time or the resources to do all of them, that's okay. Do a sampling. It kind of gives you a sense for how you're doing, right? And that's really your goal, to get a sense for how are we doing. Now, in digital content, some easy checks you could do. It's really easy to see if video content has captioning or not. You can check that relatively easily, and you can check the quality of the captioning if it's automated captioning. Now, you could also check your digital libraries and look at, when your digital libraries that you're providing access to patrons, what format are articles provided in? Is it PDF? Is it HTML? Is it something else? That often will tell you, for instance, if you're using a digital library of any type, for newspapers, anything. If you're using anything that gives people the option of like downloading in HTML, download in PDF, where they have multiple options, that's usually a good sign. Now, let's talk about VPATs. For anything, a voluntary product accessibility template. So it's known as a VPAT. Pat, is it named after you or not?
No, it is not.
No, it's not. Okay. You could tell people, for the people who are not actually on this conference, you could tell people it's named after you. You just have to figure out what the V stands for. So, okay. a voluntary product accessibility template, also an industry standard. And what it is, it's basically a document describing, right, the accessibility features or the accessibility barriers in a software application or a website. So a VPAT, usually it's companies that sell a product like a software product. So any digital databases, any digital libraries, anything like that, any software apps that you're procuring, you should ask the vendor for a VPAT. Now, a VPAT is not necessarily 100% accurate. Sometimes vendors stretch the truth a little bit, but it can at least give you a sense. If you ask a vendor and they say, a VPAT, what's that, right? Then you can say, I don't think we want to work with you, right? So check what the VPATs are. A lot of companies have their VPATs available online, and you can check. It'll at least give you a starting point to determine whether or not certain apps or digital databases are accessible or not, or at least partially accessible. By the way, if it says like partially complies, that actually means doesn't comply, not accessible. But again, get some practice reading some VPATs. Also check what are your state rules related to procurement and technology. Some states have very specific rules related to accessible technology procurements. Other states just have general procurement rules. So it would be good to get a sense of kind of what your state's rules are. And also one common mistake is that people will say, well, you know, I don't know much about accessibility, but I know that my MacBook has VoiceOver installed, the screen reader. I could just go through and see if I could understand the web page using VoiceOver. People who have no previous experience with assistive technologies often try to evaluate web content using assistive technology, don't understand how the assistive technology like a screen reader works, and then they say, oh my gosh, we have so many problems. Don't be scared off at the beginning. There are a whole bunch of barriers like that, common mistakes where people like test it with a screen reader and say, I couldn't figure out how any of that worked. Okay, but you have no experience with a screen reader. Your average person who's blind will be using a screen reader every day and will be an expert with a screen reader. Same thing with an automated web accessibility testing tool. Don't be scared away when it tells you your homepage has 700 potential errors, right? Don't, because it doesn't actually have that many errors. Now, when it comes to procurement, right? Procurement is really important. When you procure any type of digital content, any applications, any web apps, any databases, you need to make sure that accessibility is listed in the procurement contract. A vendor will not care about it unless it's in the procurement contract. Okay, so it needs to go in the procurement contract. Now, if a vendor tells you accessible content, we've never heard of that. What are you talking about? They're not being truthful to you. Vendors are under a lot of demand now for accessibility. They're getting a lot of pressure and a lot of requests, and there are a lot of lawsuits. But usually the lawsuit would go against the purchaser of the technology that's inaccessible, not the vendor, because the vendor can sell whatever they want, but obviously state government, federal government, universities, they have to procure accessibly. So you want to limit your legal liability for your library by only procuring digital content. And a great way to do that is to put it in the procurement contract. Okay, talk to the vendors about your VPATs. Ask them about if they say, well, it's not accessible, but we're working on it. Say, okay, show me the roadmap for when it will be done. Show me your schedule for when it will be done. And can we put in the contract that it will be fully accessible, you know, a year from now? And after a year, you'll indemnify us if we get sued. Now, indemnification clauses, I'm sorry to speak legalese for a minute, but indemnification clauses are really important in procurement contracts. Okay, you want to make sure that you have a clause in there that the vendor says that all of their content or applications or whatever are accessible. And you want to put in a clause, an indemnification clause, that if you as a public library get sued for having inaccessible content, that the vendor is on the hook. The vendor has indemnified you. Indemnification clauses are really important. If a vendor says, we will absolutely never sign an indemnification clause, walk away, turn around. Remember, the exit is over there, right? So walk away. Vendors, you are spending money that can be used to procure accessible materials. You need to pressure vendors on this. Vendors often don't have the legal responsibility. As libraries, you do. So that's a really good place to start in terms of doing a self-study. And once you've done a self-study, you've examined your procurement, you want to put together an overall plan for accessibility. And so this is like an IT or a digital accessibility plan. And what you want to do is have clear guidelines for when you're going to meet different milestones. You want to have support and have it led by high-level administrators. You want to be clear about what the incentives are and what the penalties are, and what resources are available, what budgetary resources will be available, how will training be provided. So if you want to get to this point of being more accessible and more inclusive with lots of accessible digital content and an accessible website, how do you get there? Well, that is your accessibility plan that you put together. And it's not going to happen overnight. So you should think about potential timelines and potential steps that are realistic for your budget and for your, for your library. So the plan, the accessibility plan, should talk specifically about the types of testing you'll do, how frequently will they occur, will it be monthly, will it be quarterly, right? Obviously, before you procure anything, there should be testing. So how often will testing take place? Who's responsible, right? And what are the processes? Will it be procurement that you use to make sure that everything from now on that is built or procured that's digital is born accessible? All of that needs to be detailed in the plan. Now you might say, well, what does a plan like that look like? Here's an example timeline. You could say that our goals are, right, that in 3 months, we're going to have our full accessibility plan in place, right? The core library website will be accessible in 6 months. 9 months from now, we will ensure that our procurement and purchasing processes include accessibility. By a year from now, all staff will have gone through training on digital accessibility. 15 months from now, you can say, okay, the online catalog is a little bit problematic right now, but 15 months from now, we'll have the online catalog be accessible because we're going to be working with our vendor if it's not already. And then 18 months out, then you could talk about even like accessible signage in the library. Hopefully 18 months from now, we'll all be back in our local public libraries in person. Accessible signage, right? You could have an advisory board of patrons with disabilities. So you can see some of these are shorter term things like the website. Some of them are maybe longer term, like putting in the advisory board and making sure the online catalog and that there's staff training. Plan all that out and be realistic, right? You want to put together a plan that's actually feasible. Now you might say, okay, can you give me an example of a library that did this and kind of how it works? So I'm going to talk about a partnership. When I was previously a professor at Towson University, we had a partnership with Baltimore County Public Library to do this exact thing. So Baltimore County Public Library in Baltimore County, Maryland, approached me when I was a professor at Towson and said, how can we as a public library provide better services to people with print disabilities? You work a lot in the accessibility area. How could we do this? Could you advise us? And so what we did was we did a class project where we had a whole semester, all right, teams of students worked on all these different areas in partnership with BCPL. And BCPL made staff available to chat with the students, and the students reviewed documents and did testing on websites. All of these things that I'm talking about, you might say, that's a lot of work. Guess what? You could create a partnership with a local university near you. Find computer science, information systems, IT, or MLS classes that focus on digital accessibility. You might even find it being called like human-computer interaction. You might find some in the business school as well, because they love putting together strategic plans. Okay, find a university partner, get students, great, energetic, thoughtful, brilliant students who can work on these issues for your library. Suddenly it seems much more manageable, right? It seems much easier. Now let's talk a little bit about Baltimore County and what the students did. Now on the screen now you see a map of Baltimore County. Now notice there's that little wedge all the way at the bottom, which is white. That's actually Baltimore City. And so Baltimore County is not shaped like a normal county because it basically surrounds the city. So you don't really have like one central library or one big city. The big city is Baltimore City, which is not part of Baltimore County. Baltimore City is essentially another county. So what you have is you have this county that's shaped around Baltimore. And so you basically have all of the major libraries are in like a crescent around the city. So there isn't one central library, but there's certainly ones that are bigger, but they're all really distributed. So in many ways for BCPL, they really wanted to do more digital format as well, because it meets well with this idea that there isn't one central library or like one really big town. Now, so they had contacted me about having Towson University students work with them to figure out how can the BCPL provide services for patrons with print disabilities, what suggestions in the future. So we split up the students into 5 teams. One team dealt with website accessibility and maintenance, right? And for that, we picked students who are really familiar with the web content accessibility guidelines and were web programmers. Another team worked on staff awareness and training. Those were the students who had some more interest in management. We had students who went to 4 or 5 locations. They did like a sampling of the physical environment and where there might be barriers for people with print disabilities in the physical environment. We had one team that looked at the digital content, databases, right, materials, digital equipment. And so that was a lot about the content. It turns out the county actually had some accessibility equipment as well, but that was primarily looking at the databases and digital content. And then one team looked at marketing materials. In the presentation here, I gave a link to the final presentations from the students that they presented to BCPL. So if you want to get a sense for what the students found and what their suggestions were, that's a YouTube link. Unfortunately, when Towson put up the video, it's an unlisted video. So you can't just search on BCPL Towson University to find it. I know, I tried. And I had to go back to my email to find the URL. So there's the URL. Maybe that's something that, Pat, you can put in the chat as well so people can just cut and paste it if they want to look at it later. So obviously, budgets are always a concern. And one of the ways that BCPL framed it was that for all student recommendations, right, you have to give 3 or 4 recommendations. Something like, we want to address this, but if we have no money, how do we best address this? If we have $1,000 per branch, how do we best address this? If we have $5,000 per branch, how do we best address this? And if we have a shower of cash from the sky, unlimited funds, which of course is not realistic, how do we address this? The reality is the students realized the point of the librarians from BCPL that, you know, we want you to make great suggestions, but also cost-effective suggestions, ones that we can actually implement, not ones that cost a lot, which sometimes students forget about. So students actually did do all 3 types: usability testing, expert inspections, and using automated web accessibility testing tools to check the accessibility of the BCPL website. Now, luckily, all the students in the class had previous experience doing accessibility inspections. That may, if you decide you want to partner with a university in some classes, that's one thing you want to check. Have the students in the class, do they have previous experience doing accessibility inspections? In terms of training, right, when the students investigated training, the students had actually, right, talked to staff about, you know, what type of training might be useful. How is training already given? Kind of what could fit in a normal schedule of training? You know, for instance, what would be most useful? Short videos, an in-person session, pamphlets? Students, interestingly enough, when they went looking for aspects that might make the physical branches more accessible, right, they actually found a few hazards that they reported back to the library. Like, for instance, this railing here, where they said people could actually fall over. And the students had suggested things like braille signage, you know, better handrails, color contrast. They actually also interviewed some people who work in orientation and mobility for blind users. So there were all of these different things that the students came up with, these different ideas, right, made very cost effective. When it came to evaluating the content in the databases, students checked the databases, they checked recent procurement documents, they looked at VPATs. They investigated whether in the libraries, BCPL could actually install screen reader technology at no cost, right? Because again, they took seriously BCPL's warning of, we have to figure out how to do this in a low-cost manner. And as it turns out, BCPL actually had assistive technologies that they could lend out to patrons that they weren't even aware that they had. So they cataloged them and said, okay, we have all these hardware things. How could we loan them out to patrons? So the students put together really great reports for BCPL. I want to encourage you to partner with universities and get some energetic, eager students who, rather than writing a research paper, would much rather work with librarians and come up with some ideas for how to make your library more inclusive and actually help the world rather than just writing a research paper. Right? The marketing materials students looked at as well, how these might be marketed, where are groups that you could market that we are now serving. You know, we're providing better service to people with print disabilities. And so, I mean, the students just had lots of different ideas. But I want to encourage you to engage with students. I want to encourage you to engage with universities. And I want to encourage you to look at, post-pandemic, how can your library better serve people with print disabilities with accessible digital content. You can do this. It's a core value that's a part of librarianship, right? It's something that's doable. It's something that's exciting. And I look forward to hearing about success stories from Pat about the great work going on in Georgia. All right, I have my email address listed there. You can always reach out to me. But Pat said to leave about 15 minutes for questions. So let's maybe start with some of the questions, Pat, if you could help moderate and facilitate those. And again, the great news, we ended the presentation. There were no earthquakes. So I now have a 1-in-1 record for earthquakes on day 3 of conferences during after lunch presentations. So 1 earthquake, 1 non-earthquake. I guess we'll have to have a tiebreaker during my next conference.
Well, we do have tornado, what are they, watches right now.
You really do?
Georgia. We
Oh
really
my gosh.
do. And I've been, my window looks to the northwest and I've been looking at the sky get darker and darker. So if you're
Oh no, I am
Georgia,
sorry, Pat. I am so
take
sorry
care.
to hear that. Everyone, please stay safe. Oh no.
Asha is going to help us with the questions. Asha, are you there to take over the questions?
I am. I'm here. I've been monitoring and I don't see questions, just commentary at this point.
I'm going to stop screen sharing, by the way. Is that okay at this point?
Sure.
And that way it's much easier for me to also look at the questions. Okay, I appreciate the kind comments. Your energy and information has been wonderful. All right, one person there has visited BCPL Perry Hall and have sisters and nieces who live in White Marsh, Towson, and Dundalk. All right, fantastic. You've got the link in there. Thank you. Yep. VPAT should be part of procurement. I agree. The V can be silent, so it's just a PAT. You're just going to ask vendors for a PAT. We want a PAT. We have a PAT. We love PAT. We want a PAT. Are there any questions? Looking through here.
Still scanning here.
Yep, I see. PDF accessibility is tough. I will tell you up front, it is harder. It's harder to make a PDF. It takes more time than an EPUB 3 or an HTML document. And again, I work on collaborative research with Adobe Research, and I'm trying to work with them on this specific issue. And they're sympathetic, and we're making progress. Part of the challenge is the tools. The tools just need to be better. So we're working on that.
And that was my comment, that PDF creation was tough.
Yep.
Accessible PDF creation was
It
tough.
really is.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in the business of telling people how easy it is to do accessibility. That's my passion, is showing people how easy it is. And one of the challenges is we have to acknowledge HTML accessibility is easy, right? Done. Easy. EPUB accessibility, easy. Because of the tools. It's not that PDF accessibility is inherently. Can I actually give you an unofficial kind of tip and trick that you may not find anywhere else on PDF accessibility?
I would love that.
Okay,
Yeah.
So here's the thing that often people don't realize. And I didn't realize really till I was doing more work with Adobe. So you think that creating a PDF document using Word, using either a Mac version or Windows version, would create the same level of accessibility, right? Regardless of what application you use, it'll create the same accessible PDF, right? No.
Right.
So the most accessible, the way to have the most possible accessible markup, right, go into your PDF from the start, is to go into Adobe Acrobat Pro using only the Windows version, right? Use the Windows version of Adobe Acrobat Pro, load your Microsoft Word or whatever document into Adobe Acrobat Pro, and create the PDF there. If you do it in Windows, you might get like 70 to 80% of the accessibility markup that's already there from Word will actually show up. Now here's why actually you might say, well, okay, but what's the difference? The Mac version of both Adobe Acrobat Pro and Word will actually carry over less of the accessibility markup. So like the worst way to do it is if you were going to use MS Word for Mac and create the PDF from within MS Word, that's going to get you probably less than half of the markup transferred over into the PDF. So it's like a sliding scale. Like, you know, the best thing is use Acrobat Pro within Windows, right? Then the next one might be use Word for Windows. Then the next one might be Acrobat Pro on a Mac. Then, although I don't know exactly where the difference is between Acrobat Pro on a Mac versus Word on Windows, but don't whenever possible, go in and use Adobe Acrobat Pro, right? Use it there on Windows. Don't use it in Word if possible, and don't do it on a Mac. I'm not saying that's the way it should be. I'm just saying that's the realistic situation. Okay, I think there are now a few questions, right?
Well, yeah, someone asked, well, that's not the first one, I'm sorry. Do you recommend NVDA?
Okay, so NVDA is the open source screen reader, NVDA. And so NVDA, if you're looking to find a screen reader that you can download, quickly install, if you want to put some screen readers into your library, right, free of charge, certainly NVDA is a great choice. If you want to use it for testing, there's actually, maybe a little while ago I would have said not as much, but now there's a lot more free information out there on the web on doing testing. So there's a great organization, and I'm going to put this in the chat, WebAIM. So if you go to the WebAIM organization, they have a lot of, we'll call them kind of cheat sheets or quick guides. Quick guides is better than cheat sheets. Quick guides related to testing web content using screen readers. Okay, so NVDA is great. Remember that if you have any Mac computers, if you have any recent, pretty much anything iOS recently, you will have the VoiceOver screen reader already installed. So it actually costs nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I see a few questions about Pave and Acrobat Pro. Okay, so yeah, Pave is a free tool that's online. I've met and chatted with, and we've done some usability testing on Pave. If you don't have any access to Adobe Acrobat Pro, you might use Pave. It's nowhere near as good as Acrobat Pro. It probably will get you a little bit further down the road, Pave. But I know they've been making some improvements, so it could be that shortly they'll have a better one. Now, Acrobat Pro, yes, it does cost. However, Adobe has partnerships with universities and with libraries. So if you need to have Acrobat Pro, reach out to Adobe and actually tell them that accessibility is really important to you, because Adobe is slowly, as a company, getting more and more involved with accessibility. So tell them that you're interested in Acrobat Pro for libraries, and it's because you want to make your documents accessible. It's important for them to hear it. They're making progress, but they need to hear that that's why people really are interested in getting the Acrobat Pro. How do we partner with groups to test the websites was the question. Yep. Okay. So there are a few different categories of groups. Now, I kind of gave the suggestion of working with universities, finding students. That's really great. Another thing you could do is reach out. I mean, there are a lot of, I know there's Georgia has a really strong chapter of the National Federation of the Blind. You could reach out to them and say, hey, we're trying to provide better services at the local public libraries. Could you give us some feedback? Most disability groups want to give you feedback. They want to tell you, kind of, here are things that potentially you could do to make the library more welcoming for us. So a lot of disability advocacy groups, right, can help you with that. I'm guessing also, Pat, I'm guessing that GLASS could also give feedback, right? Because you have such a great resource there in your services, you could probably give feedback to local libraries as well. Georgia Tech also has. They have a few different resources related to accessibility at Georgia Tech. I think they have a few different research centers at Georgia Tech.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Georgia Tech does. I'll jump in and say they made 2 of our presenter slides accessible for us for this very conference. And they're working, I'm sure that, although like you said, it's really like one of their research centers, but they must have affiliations with the teaching program at Georgia Tech as well. And of course we have Valdosta. I haven't specifically approached them about anything like this, but they're our state library school, and I do think they're open to this. They finally, for the first time, and I've been in my position for 8 years now, they finally asked me to give a guest lecture last fall. So we're making progress, guys.
By the way, that would be a perfect type of partnership right there with the library school because you could see the potential partnerships could be great there. There's a large number, I know at Georgia Tech, they have a really big research center on human-computer interaction. So you may find some good partners there as well. Often people in web design and web programming programs are learning about web accessibility. So if you just wanted to focus about web accessibility, you might actually be able to find at most state universities that are teaching web design, which most of them are. So, but yeah, I mean, approach them and say, and if I can do anything to help facilitate, by all means, let me know. But say that we want to move our, public library towards more inclusiveness, and we'd like to, work with students who could maybe help us. Absolutely.
I would like to remind everybody, specifically anybody who works in a Pines library, Georgia Tech CIDI, the Center for Inclusive Design and Innovation, did do a survey of the Evergreen interface last year. And what they do is give a list of things that need to be worked on. And then the Pines team and the other Evergreen members take that to the developers and they work to fix things. So there have been efforts on a statewide level here in Georgia to make the Pines catalog accessible.
Great. Are there any other questions? I'm just scanning through. We talked about PAVE, we talked about Acrobat Pro, we talked about partnerships, NVDA. Are there any questions there that I missed? Anything else?
I think you missed this one. Do you have any staff training suggestions pre-self-testing phase?
Staff training suggestions. Actually, for accessibility, for very short training, there are a fair number of YouTube videos about accessibility. So, you might want to find the ones that kind of are the best fit for the specific focus for your library. But there are, keep in mind that a number, for instance, the ADA, Regional Americans with Disabilities Act, Technical Assistance Centers, a lot of them have free videos up related to accessibility. For instance, if let's say you said, Pat and Asha, you said, okay, we're going to set up some kiosks and I want a video about kiosk accessibility, right? We did an hour and a half long video for the Great Lakes ADA Center on kiosk accessibility. So look at maybe some of the ADA centers where they have a lot of videos available about training on specific aspects. Also, the Web Accessibility Initiative, which creates all the technical standards, they've actually added a lot of videos, more serious videos, not just the music video. They've added a lot of good short videos about web accessibility. Yeah, in fact, ADA Southeast, I gave a talk for a number of years ago to the ADA Southeast Center. So yeah, that's a perfect example right there.
Excellent. I don't see any. Am I missing any? Raise your hand if we overlooked your question.
Well, I'm not seeing any more, and it looks like we are right on time, right as I'm hearing thunder outside of my home right now. And thank you, Dr. Lazar. This has been a fantastic presentation. Who could have guessed that I could read just your words on a page and end up with a dynamic presenter like you are? So thank you so much.
Thank you for your kind words, Pat. Thank you to everyone for attending today. And again, reach out to me. Look forward to chatting with everyone. Get out there and do great work of making your public libraries more inclusive. Yay.